What would you do if a stranger appeared on your property during the worst storm in decades, clutching nothing but a guitar and secrets that could change everything? This is exactly what happened to Lady Amelia Ashford on a Tuesday evening that would turn her world upside down. The sky above Northumberland had been brewing trouble all afternoon. Dark clouds rolled across the moorland like an army advancing on Ashford Grange, and Amelia could smell the electricity in the air. She'd lived on this estate for 32 years. Through every season the English countryside could throw at her, but something about this storm felt different, dangerous. "Sovereign, come on, boy," she called to her prized gray dapple stallion, who was prancing nervously in the far paddock. The other horses had already sensed the approaching chaos and were clustering near the stable doors, but Sovereign was stubborn as always, standing his ground against the wind that was now whipping Amelia's dark hair across her face. Thunder rumbled overhead, still distant but getting closer by the minute. Amelia grabbed the lead rope from the fence post and started jogging toward Sovereign, her Wellington boots squelching in the mud that was already forming from the first fat raindrops. The estate stretched around her in all directions, rolling hills dotted with stone walls that had stood for centuries, the old manor house looming behind her with its weathered gray stones and ivy-covered walls. "Easy, boy," she murmured as she approached Sovereign, who was now tossing his magnificent head and snorting at the darkening sky. His coat gleamed silver gray in the strange light that comes before a storm, muscles rippling under his skin as he danced sideways. This horse was worth more than most people's houses, the last valuable asset the Ashford family had left, and Amelia couldn't afford to lose him to a lightning strike or a panicked bolt into the moors. Just as she clipped the lead rope to his halter, a flash of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Sovereign reared up, his hooves flashing dangerously close to Amelia's head, and that's when she saw him. A man was lying crumpled against the stone wall that bordered the eastern paddock, about 50 yards away. He wasn't moving. In his arms, protected against his chest like a baby, was an acoustic guitar case, its leather surface dark with rain. "What the hell?" Amelia breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Sovereign was pulling against the rope, desperate to get to shelter, but she couldn't just leave an unconscious stranger out in what was rapidly becoming a dangerous storm. Another lightning flash illuminated the scene more clearly. The man appeared to be in his 30s, wearing expensive-looking clothes that were now soaked through, dark jeans, a button-down shirt, and a leather jacket that had seen better days. His dark hair was plastered to his head, and even from a distance, she could see he was completely unconscious. The rain was coming down harder now, turning from drops to sheets of water that stung her face and made it difficult to see. Amelia made a split-second decision that would change everything. She tied Sovereign's lead rope to the nearest fence post, he'd have to wait, and ran toward the stranger. "Hey, can you hear me?" she shouted over the wind as she dropped to her knees beside him. Up close, she could see he was breathing, but his face was pale, and there was a nasty bump on his forehead where he'd apparently hit the stone wall. His left hand, still gripping the guitar case, bore an old scar that ran from his knuckles to his wrist. Lightning struck again, this time close enough that the thunder was almost instantaneous. The hair on Amelia's arms stood up, and she knew they were in serious danger. She grabbed the man under his arms and started dragging him toward the stable, his boots scraping against the muddy ground. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and dead weight, and the guitar case kept banging against her legs. Come on," she muttered through gritted teeth, her muscles straining as she hauled him across the paddock. The stable seemed impossibly far away, and the storm was getting worse by the second. Wind howled across the moors, carrying the scent of rain and something wilder, the smell of a storm that meant business. Sovereign was whinnying frantically now, pulling against his rope as hail began to mix with the rain, small white pellets that stung like angry wasps. Amelia's shoulders burned with the effort of dragging the unconscious stranger, but she kept going, step by muddy step, until finally she reached the stable doors. The old wooden doors were heavy and stubborn, swollen with moisture, and it took all her strength to haul them open with one hand while supporting the stranger with the other. Inside, the stable was warm and dry, filled with the comforting smell of hay and horses. The other animals were restless but safe, stamping and snorting in their stalls. Amelia dragged the man to an empty stall and propped him against the wall, then ran back out into the storm to get Sovereign. The stallion came willingly now, eager for shelter, and she led him quickly into his stall before slamming the stable doors shut just as the storm reached its full fury outside. Thunder crashed overhead like the world was ending, and lightning turned the small windows white with electric fire. Amelia stood there dripping and breathing hard, staring down at the stranger who'd literally dropped into her life. His guitar case lay beside him, and she could see now that it was old and well-traveled, covered with stickers from places she'd never been. Who was he? What was he doing on her property in the middle of nowhere? And why was she risking her life and her horse to save a complete stranger who might be anyone? A thief, a vagrant, or worse? As if summoned by her thoughts, the man's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, confused and unfocused, and when they met hers, Amelia felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. Those dark brown eyes stared up at Amelia with a mixture of confusion and wariness that made her take an instinctive step backward. The stranger pushed himself up against the stable wall, wincing as his hand went to the bump on his forehead, and she noticed how his fingers automatically tightened around the guitar case, like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Easy there," Amelia said, her voice sharper than she intended. The adrenaline from dragging him through the storm was wearing off, replaced by a cold realization of what she'd just done. She'd brought a complete stranger into her stable, surrounded by thousands of pounds worth of horses and equipment, without knowing the first thing about him. "Who are you? And what the hell are you doing on my property?" The man blinked slowly, as if trying to focus, then carefully set his guitar case down beside him. When he spoke, his voice was rough but educated, with the kind of accent that spoke of expensive schools and London boardrooms. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trespass. I was walking the footpath when the storm hit, and I must have gotten turned around in the rain." "Walking the footpath?" Amelia's eyebrows shot up. "The nearest public footpath is 3 miles from here, and it doesn't go anywhere near this paddock. Try again." Outside, the storm was still raging, thunder rolling across the moors like artillery fire. The stable felt smaller with this stranger in it, and Amelia was acutely aware that she was alone with him except for the horses. Sovereign snorted from his stall, as if sensing the tension in the air. The man struggled to his feet, moving carefully, and Amelia got her first good look at him. He was tall, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his soaked shirt in a way that suggested he wasn't afraid of physical work, despite his soft hands. The scar on his left hand was old and jagged, like something from a childhood accident, and there was something about the way he held himself that reminded her of a soldier trying not to show he was wounded. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, running his uninjured hand through his wet hair. "I just need somewhere to wait out the storm, and then I'll be gone. You won't even know I was here." "Oh, I'll know," Amelia shot back. "Because you're bleeding on my stable floor, and because you still haven't told me who you are or what you're really doing here. People don't just wander onto private estates in Northumberland by accident, especially not carrying expensive guitars and wearing clothes that cost more than most people make in a month." The stranger's jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw something flash in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or pain. "My name is Tom," he said finally. "Tom Hawthorne. And you're right, I wasn't just passing through. I was looking for somewhere to think. Somewhere quiet." "Well, you found it," Amelia said dryly. "But thinking doesn't require trespassing, and it sure as hell doesn't explain why you were unconscious against my wall. What really happened out there?" Tom touched his forehead again, and she could see the bruise was already darkening. "I slipped in the mud when the lightning started. Hit my head on the stone wall. Lucky you found me when you did." The way he said it made Amelia think there was more to the story. But before she could press him further, a new voice cut through the sound of rain on the roof. "Miss Amelia? Miss Amelia, are you in there?" It was Alfie Clark, the 16-year-old who helped around the stables after school. She could hear him struggling with the heavy doors. "I'm here, Alfie," she called back, shooting Tom a warning look. "Come in, but mind the horses. They're still spooked from the storm." Alfie burst through the doors in a shower of raindrops, his red hair plastered to his skull and his eyes wide with excitement. "Blimey, Miss Amelia, that was some storm. I was worried about Sovereign and the others, so I came to check." His words trailed off as he spotted Tom standing in the shadows. "Oh, hello." "Alfie, this is Tom," Amelia said carefully. "He got caught in the storm and needed shelter." "Tom, this is Alfie. He helps me with the horses." Tom nodded at the boy, and Amelia noticed how he seemed to shrink back into himself, as if he didn't want to be seen. There was definitely something this man was running from, and she was beginning to think it might be more than just bad weather. "Right then," she said, making a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. "Tom, you can stay in the stable tonight, but come morning, you're gone. And if you want to sleep somewhere dry instead of in a pile of hay, you'll work for it." "Work for it?" Tom's eyebrows rose. "The storm's made a mess of everything. Stalls need mucking out, fresh hay needs spreading, water troughs need cleaning. Alfie can show you what needs doing." She fixed him with a hard stare. "And you don't go near Sovereign. That horse is worth more than this entire stable, and he doesn't take kindly to strangers." As if summoned by his name, Sovereign whinnied from his stall, a sound that was part greeting and part warning. The gray stallion's head appeared over the stall door, his intelligent eyes taking in the scene with what looked like aristocratic disdain. "He's beautiful," Tom said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made Amelia look at him more closely. "Pure Hanoverian. You know horses?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "A little." Tom's smile was rueful. "My father always said a gentleman should know horses, wine, and how to lose money gracefully. I seem to have mastered at least 2 of those." There was bitterness in his voice that spoke of recent wounds, and Amelia found herself curious despite her better judgment. But before she could ask any more questions, another crash of thunder shook the building, and Sovereign reared up in his stall, his hooves striking the wooden walls. "Easy, boy," Amelia murmured, moving toward the stall with practiced calm. "It's just noise. You're safe." But Sovereign was beyond listening. The storm had him spooked, and he was working himself into a panic that could result in serious injury. His eyes were rolling white, and foam was starting to appear around his bit. Without thinking, Tom stepped forward. "May I?" he asked quietly. Amelia hesitated. Sovereign was her prize stallion, her last hope of keeping the estate afloat, and she'd just met this man an hour ago. But something in Tom's voice, a quiet confidence that spoke of experience, made her nod. Tom approached the stall slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He began to hum, a low, wordless tune that seemed to cut through the sound of the storm. Sovereign's ears pricked forward, and gradually, impossibly, the great horse began to settle. "That's it," Tom murmured, still humming. "Just a bit of weather. Nothing to worry about. You're safe here." Amelia watched in amazement as Sovereign's breathing slowed and his eyes lost their wild look. In 5 minutes, Tom had accomplished what usually took her half an hour of patient work. "How did you do that?" Alfie whispered, his eyes wide with admiration. Tom shrugged, stepping back from the stall. Sometimes they just need to know someone's listening. As the storm began to ease outside, Amelia found herself looking at Tom Hawthorne with new eyes. Whatever secrets he was carrying, whatever had brought him to her door in the middle of a Northumberland tempest, one thing was clear. This was no ordinary stranger. And despite every instinct telling her to be careful, she was beginning to think that might not be entirely a bad thing. The question was, what was he really running from, and how long before it caught up with him? Dawn broke over Northumberland like a painter's first brushstroke across canvas, washing the rolling moorland in shades of gold and green that seemed to stretch forever. The storm had passed, leaving behind that peculiar clarity that only comes after nature has thrown her worst tantrum and moved on. Amelia stood at the stable door, breathing in air so clean it made her lungs ache, watching as morning mist rose from the valleys between the hills, like ghostly fingers reaching toward heaven. Tom was already awake, she noticed with surprise. He'd made himself a bed of fresh hay in the corner stall, and now he was methodically mucking out the horses' quarters with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of someone who understood the value of hard work. His expensive clothes from yesterday had been replaced by spare coveralls she'd found hanging in the tack room. They were too small for his frame, but he wore them without complaint, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were more muscled than she'd expected from a former city trader. "You're up early," she said, stepping into the stable with 2 steaming mugs of tea. The ritual of morning tea was as ingrained in her as breathing. Proper English breakfast, milk, 1 sugar, and she'd made an extra cup without really thinking about it. Tom straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Old habits," he said, accepting the mug gratefully. "My father always said the day starts when you start it, not when the sun decides to show up." There was something different about him this morning. Yesterday's wariness had been replaced by a kind of focused calm, as if the physical work had settled something restless in his soul. He moved around the horses with surprising confidence, and she noticed how they responded to him, ears forward, curious rather than skittish. "You weren't kidding about knowing horses," Amelia observed, watching as he scratched behind the ears of Duchess, a temperamental mare who usually bit strangers. "My grandfather kept a small stable in Surrey," Tom said, his voice taking on a softer quality. "I spent summers there as a boy before." He trailed off, but she could fill in the blanks. Before life got complicated, before responsibility and expectation and the weight of family legacy crushed whatever simple joy he'd found in those childhood summers. The morning passed in companionable silence, broken only by the sounds of work, the scrape of shovels, the rustle of fresh hay, the contented snorts of well-tended horses. Alfie arrived around 9, his red hair still damp from his morning wash, eyes bright with the kind of energy that only 16-year-olds possessed. "Blimey, Tom, you've done half my work already," the boy said, grinning as he surveyed the clean stalls. "Miss Amelia, can we keep him?" "He's not a stray dog, Alfie," Amelia replied dryly, but there was warmth in her voice. The boy had taken to Tom immediately, with the uncomplicated acceptance of youth, and she could see Tom responding to Alfie's enthusiasm with something that looked almost like paternal fondness. "Right then," Tom said, setting down his pitchfork. "What's next on the list?" The list, as it turned out, was extensive. Storm damage had left fence posts loose, gutters clogged with debris, and the small vegetable garden that supplied the estate's kitchen looking like a battlefield. They worked through the morning in easy rhythm. Tom's methodical approach, balancing Alfie's eager energy, while Amelia moved between tasks with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been managing an estate since she was barely older than Alfie himself. By noon, the sun had burned off the last of the morning mist, revealing the moorland in all its wild beauty. Purple heather stretched across the hills like a royal carpet, broken by outcroppings of gray stone that had stood since before the Romans came. In the distance, she could see the ruins of an old peel tower, one of the fortified houses that had once protected this borderland from Scottish raiders centuries ago. "It's beautiful," Tom said quietly, following her gaze. He'd come to stand beside her at the paddock fence, and she was acutely aware of his presence. The way he smelled of honest sweat and hay, the careful way he held himself as if he was afraid of taking up too much space. "It's home," she replied simply. "Has been for 8 generations of Ashfords. My great-great-grandfather built the current house after he came back from the Crimean War. Said he'd seen enough of foreign places to last him a lifetime. And now?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. Now the bank was circling like vultures, and developers like Lord Fairfax were waiting to pick the bones clean. Now she was one bad season away from losing everything her family had built, and she was standing here making conversation with a stranger who'd literally blown in with the storm. "Now we take it one day at a time," she said finally. They broke for lunch around 1, thick sandwiches made with bread from the village bakery, sharp cheddar from the local dairy, and tea so strong it could wake the dead. They sat on the stone steps of the stable, looking out over the paddocks where Sovereign grazed peacefully, his gray coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Tell me about him," Tom said, nodding toward the stallion. "Sovereign. He's special, isn't he?" Amelia's face softened as she watched her prize horse. "He's the last of his bloodline from this estate. His great-grandfather was a Hanoverian stallion my grandfather imported from Germany in the 1960s. Cost him a fortune he couldn't afford, but he said some things were worth going into debt for." She paused, the irony not lost on her. "Sovereign's won more ribbons than I can count, and his stud fees, well, they're what's kept this place running the last few years. And if you lose the estate, he goes with it." The words came out flatter than she intended. "Everything goes with it." Tom was quiet for a long moment, and when she glanced at him, she saw something in his expression that looked like understanding. Not pity, she would have hated pity, but the recognition of someone who knew what it meant to lose something precious. My father always said land was the only real wealth, he said finally. Everything else, stocks, bonds, currency, it's all just paper and promises, but land endures. Your father sounds like a wise man. Tom's laugh was bitter. He was many things. Wise wasn't always one of them. The afternoon stretched on, filled with the kind of peaceful productivity that Amelia had almost forgotten existed. Tom proved surprisingly handy with repairs, his city-soft hands quickly developing calluses as he helped Alfie mend a section of fence that had been damaged in the storm. There was something almost meditative about the work, the simple satisfaction of fixing what was broken, of making order from chaos. As evening approached, they gathered in the kitchen of the main house, a vast room with stone floors and copper pots hanging from ancient beams. Mrs. Whitby, the housekeeper, had prepared a proper English tea, scones with clotted cream and jam, cucumber sandwiches with the crusts cut off, and a Victoria sponge that was her particular pride and joy. "You'll stay for tea, won't you, Mr. Hawthorne?" Mrs. Whitby asked, her tone making it clear that refusal wasn't really an option. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of no-nonsense manner that had kept the Ashford household running smoothly for the past 20 years. "I wouldn't want to impose," Tom began, but Amelia cut him off. "You've earned it," she said simply. "Besides, Mrs. Whitby's scones are legendary in 3 counties. It would be a crime to let you leave without trying them." So they sat around the old oak table as shadows lengthened outside the windows, talking about everything and nothing. The weather, the state of the local economy, Alfie's plans for university, Mrs. Whitby's ongoing war with the rabbits in the vegetable garden. It was ordinary conversation, the kind that happens in kitchens across England every evening. But there was something precious about it, too. For the first time in months, Amelia felt like she was part of something larger than her own worries, connected to other people in a way that had nothing to do with money or obligations, or the weight of family history. Tom fit into the group with surprising ease, asking thoughtful questions and listening with genuine interest to the answers. He had the gift of making people feel heard, she realized, and she wondered if that was something he'd learned in his city days, or if it was simply part of who he was beneath the expensive clothes and careful manners. As the evening wound down and Alfie headed home on his bicycle, pedaling through the gathering dusk with the casual fearlessness of youth, Amelia found herself reluctant to let the day end. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries, new reminders of how precarious her situation really was. But tonight, for just a few hours, she'd felt like herself again. Not Lady Amelia Ashford, last of a dying line, but simply Amelia. A woman who loved her horses and her land and the quiet rhythms of rural life. "Thank you," Tom said quietly as they stood in the stable doorway, watching the first stars appear over the moors. "For today, for this." She knew what he meant. Sometimes salvation came not in grand gestures, but in small kindnesses, in the simple act of being allowed to belong somewhere, even temporarily. Tomorrow he would leave as they'd agreed, and life would return to its familiar patterns of worry and struggle. But tonight, they had this moment of peace, this brief respite from whatever storms, literal and metaphorical, awaited them both. Neither of them knew that by morning, everything would change again. The night settled over Ashford Grange like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the kind of profound quiet that only exists in the deep countryside. No traffic, no sirens, no urban hum, just the whisper of wind through heather and the distant call of a barn owl hunting across the moors. Amelia had finished her evening rounds, checking on each horse one final time, ensuring water troughs were full and stable doors properly latched. It was a ritual as old as her family's presence on this land, a connection to generations of Ashfords who had walked these same paths under these same stars. She was heading back to the house when she heard it. The soft, melancholy sound of a guitar being played with the kind of skill that spoke of years of practice. The melody drifted from the stable, hauntingly beautiful in the stillness, and she found herself drawn toward it like a moth to flame. She recognized the song after a few bars, "Dust in the Wind" by Kansas. That achingly perfect meditation on the temporary nature of all things human. Tom sat on a bale of hay in the corner of the stable, his back against the stone wall, fingers moving across the strings of his acoustic guitar with practiced ease. The instrument was old, she could see now in the lamplight, the wood worn smooth by countless hours of playing, the finish dulled to a warm honey color that spoke of age and use. This wasn't some expensive showpiece. This was a working musician's guitar, loved and lived in. His voice, when he began to sing, was rough around the edges, but true, carrying the weight of someone who understood the lyrics on a level deeper than mere performance. I close my eyes, only for a moment, and the moment's gone. All my dreams pass before my eyes. A curiosity. Dust in the wind the morning after the fireworks incident dawned gray and oppressive, with low clouds hanging over the moors like a funeral shroud. Amelia woke with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from emotional upheaval, the events of the previous night playing on repeat in her mind. Tom's extraordinary connection with Sovereign, the way he'd risked his own safety without hesitation, the growing sense that this stranger was becoming something more than a temporary guest. It all swirled together in a confusion of feelings she wasn't ready to examine. She was in the kitchen, mechanically going through the motions of making breakfast, when Mrs. Whitby appeared in the doorway with an expression that made Amelia's stomach drop to her boots. The housekeeper was holding an official-looking envelope, the kind that never brought good news, and her usually composed face was pale with worry. "This came with the Morning Post, Miss Amelia," Mrs. Whitby said quietly, setting the envelope on the scrubbed oak table like it might explode. "From Barclays." Amelia's hands trembled as she tore open the envelope, though she already knew what it would contain. The letter was brief and brutally professional, couched in the kind of banking language that made threats sound like polite suggestions. Final notice. 30 days to settle outstanding debt. Failure to comply would result in immediate foreclosure proceedings. The amount at the bottom, $847,000, might as well have been £1 million for all the chance she had of raising it. 30 days, she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "They're giving me 30 days to find nearly £1 million. Mrs. Whitby's face crumpled with sympathy. "Oh, my dear girl, your father would be turning in his grave if he knew what those vultures were doing to his family's land." Before Amelia could respond, the sound of expensive tires on gravel announced another arrival. Through the kitchen window, she could see a gleaming black Range Rover pulling up the drive, its chrome bumpers and tinted windows screaming money and power. The vehicle looked obscenely out of place against the weathered stone of the estate buildings, like a predator that had wandered into a peaceful meadow. "Who on earth?" Mrs. Whitby muttered, but Amelia already knew. She'd been expecting this visit ever since the first missed payment, dreading it with the kind of sick anticipation that comes with knowing your worst fears are about to be realized. The man who emerged from the Range Rover was everything Amelia had imagined and worse. Lord Julian Fairfax was tall and impeccably dressed, his Savile Row suit fitting him like armor, his silver hair swept back in the kind of style that spoke of expensive barbers and unlimited confidence. He moved with the predatory grace of someone who had never been told no, never been denied anything he wanted, and right now what he wanted was her family's 800-year legacy. "Lady Ashford," he said when she opened the front door, his voice carrying the kind of upper-class accent that had been weaponized by centuries of privilege. "How delightful to finally meet you in person. I'm Julian Fairfax, Fairfax Developments. I believe my office has been in touch regarding your situation." The way he said situation made it sound like a minor inconvenience rather than the destruction of everything she held dear. Amelia forced herself to stand straighter, drawing on reserves of aristocratic dignity that went back generations of Ashfords who had faced down Scottish raiders, Napoleon's armies, and 2 world wars. "Lord Fairfax," she replied coolly. "I wasn't expecting a personal visit. Usually vultures circle from a distance before they descend." His laugh was genuinely amused, as if her defiance was nothing more than entertaining theater. "How refreshingly direct. I do appreciate honesty in business dealings. May I come in? I have a proposition that I think you'll find illuminating." Against her better judgment, Amelia led him into the morning room, a space that had once hosted prime ministers and poets, but now felt shabby and faded under his appraising gaze. Fairfax settled into her father's favorite chair, as if he already owned it, which, she reflected bitterly, he essentially did. "I'll be frank with you, Lady Ashford," he began, pulling out a leather portfolio that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Your financial situation is challenging. The bank is losing patience, the estate is hemorrhaging money, and frankly, you're fighting a losing battle against economic reality." "Get to the point," Amelia said through gritted teeth. "The point is salvation," Fairfax replied smoothly. Fairfax Development specializes in transforming underutilized rural properties into luxury destinations. We see tremendous potential in Ashford Grange. The location is spectacular, the buildings have character, and the Northumberland market is absolutely crying out for high-end hospitality options. He opened his portfolio and spread out a series of glossy renderings that made Amelia's blood run cold. Her family's ancient manor house had been transformed into a gleaming spa resort, complete with glass extensions and modern sculptures that looked like metallic tumors growing from the stone walls. The stables where Sovereign lived had become a wellness center, and the paddocks where her horses grazed had been carved up into manicured gardens and a golf course that looked like it belonged in Florida, not the wild beauty of the Northumberland moors. "We're prepared to offer you $1.2 million for the entire estate," Fairfax continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic cadence of a practiced salesman. "That's enough to pay off your debts and leave you with a tidy sum to start fresh somewhere more manageable. A nice cottage in the Cotswolds, perhaps. Somewhere you can keep a horse or 2 as pets." The casual dismissal of her life's work, the reduction of Sovereign from a magnificent stallion to a mere pet, hit Amelia like a physical blow. But it was the next part of his presentation that truly made her feel sick. "Of course, we understand the sentimental value of family heritage," Fairfax said, with the kind of false sympathy that made her want to slap him. "That's why we're prepared to name the resort the Ashford in honor of your family's contribution to the area. There will be a small plaque in the lobby explaining the historical significance of the site. Very tasteful, very respectful." A plaque. 8 centuries of Ashford history reduced to a brass plaque in a hotel lobby, something for wealthy tourists to glance at while they sipped overpriced cocktails and complained about the weather. The sheer audacity of it left her speechless. "I can see you're overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer," Fairfax said, misreading her stunned silence. "But I'm afraid time is rather pressing. The bank has made it clear that they want this matter resolved quickly. And frankly, Lady Ashford, you don't have many options. It's either accept our offer now, or wait 30 days and watch everything go to auction for a fraction of what we're offering." He leaned forward, and she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, the scent of a predator closing in for the kill. "I knew your father, you know. Lovely man, but perhaps not the most practical when it came to business matters. He always said the land would provide, but land doesn't pay mortgages, does it? Land doesn't keep the lights on or put food on the table." The mention of her father was the final straw. Amelia stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the floor like a gunshot. "Get out," she said quietly. "I beg your pardon?" "I said get out. Get out of my house. Get off my land. And don't come back unless you're prepared to discuss this matter with my solicitor." Fairfax's mask of polite concern slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Lady Ashford, I understand you're emotional, but emotion doesn't change mathematics. You owe nearly £1 million, and you have 30 days to find it. Where exactly do you think that money is going to come from? The tooth fairy? That's my concern, not yours." "Actually, it's very much my concern," Fairfax replied, standing and straightening his tie with deliberate precision. "Because when you fail, and you will fail, I'll be here to pick up the pieces. The only question is whether you want to walk away with dignity and a fair price, or whether you'd prefer to be dragged out by the bailiffs while your precious horses are sold to the highest bidder." The threat hung in the air between them like poison gas. Amelia could picture it all too clearly. Sovereign led away by strangers, the ancient stones of her family home violated by developers, everything she'd fought to preserve scattered to the winds like dust. 30 days, Fairfax repeated as he gathered his papers. "Think about it, Lady Ashford. Think about what's really best for everyone involved. My offer won't remain open indefinitely." He paused at the door, and when he turned back, his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, and do give my regards to Thomas Hawthorne when you see him. We were at Eton together, you know. Lovely fellow, though I heard he's had some rather unfortunate financial difficulties of his own recently. Funny how these things work out, isn't it?" The casual mention of Tom's name hit Amelia like a slap. How did Fairfax know about Tom? What connection did they have? And what did he mean about Tom's financial difficulties? But before she could ask any of these questions, Fairfax was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the echo of threats wrapped in silk. Amelia stood in the morning room, surrounded by portraits of her ancestors, and felt the weight of 8 centuries of history pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. 30 days to save everything she'd ever loved. 30 days to find nearly £1 million. 30 days before Lord Julian Fairfax turned her family's legacy into just another luxury resort for people who had more money than soul. Outside, she could hear Tom working in the stables, his voice carrying across the yard as he talked to the horses with the same gentle authority he'd shown during the fireworks crisis. The sound should have been comforting, but now it only raised more questions. What was his connection to Fairfax? What financial difficulties had driven him to her door? And could she trust a man whose past was apparently entangled with the very predator who was trying to destroy her future? The bank letter lay on the table where she'd dropped it, its official seal looking like a death warrant in the gray morning light. 30 days. The countdown had begun, and Amelia Ashford had never felt more alone in her life. The first thing Amelia noticed when she walked into the stable that morning was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of horses at rest, but something deeper, more unsettling. The kind of silence that comes when something essential has been removed from a place where it belonged. Sovereign stood in his stall, his magnificent gray head turned toward the corner where Tom had made his makeshift bed. And there was something almost accusatory in the stallion's dark eyes, as if he too understood that they had been abandoned. The letter was propped against an empty feed bucket, her name written across the envelope in Tom's careful handwriting. Amelia's hands trembled as she tore it open, though she already knew what it would say. Men like Tom Hawthorne didn't stay in places like Ashford Grange when the real world came calling. They didn't choose muddy paddocks over marble boardrooms, didn't choose struggling estates over whatever comfortable life waited for them back in London. "Dear Amelia," the letter began, and even his formal tone felt like a slap. "By the time you read this, I'll be on the morning train back to London. I want you to know that the past few days at Ashford Grange have been among the most peaceful I've experienced in years. You and your family's legacy deserve better than the financial vultures circling your estate. And I hope you find a way to save what your ancestors built." She had to stop reading for a moment. Her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. Through the stable window, she could see Mrs. Whitby hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets snapping in the morning breeze like surrender flags. Alfie would arrive soon for his after-school duties, full of questions about where Tom had gone, and she would have to find words to explain something she didn't understand herself. "I realize my departure may seem sudden," the letter continued, "but recent events have made it clear that my presence here puts you in an impossible position. Lord Fairfax and I have a history that goes back to our school days, and that history has nothing to do with you or your troubles. I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked to preserve." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatically phrased, but they felt like ice water in her veins. What history? What had happened between Tom and Fairfax that was so terrible it required him to disappear like a thief in the night? And why hadn't he trusted her enough to explain, to let her make her own decisions about what risks she was willing to take? She forced herself to keep reading, though each word felt like a small betrayal. "Please don't think poorly of me for leaving this way. Some battles are better fought alone, and some secrets are too dangerous to share with people you care about. Take care of Sovereign. He's a remarkable horse, and he deserves the kind of life you can give him. Take care of yourself, Amelia. You're stronger than you know." The letter was signed simply Tom, and beneath his name was a small sketch of a guitar, the kind of detail that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. He'd taken the time to draw that little picture, had sat in the pre-dawn darkness thinking about how to say goodbye, and yet he'd still chosen to leave without giving her a chance to respond, to argue, to fight for whatever connection had been growing between them. Amelia crumpled the letter in her fist, then immediately smoothed it out again, as if destroying his words would somehow make his absence more final. The rational part of her mind understood his reasoning. Fairfax had made it clear that Tom's presence complicated an already impossible situation, and a man with any sense would remove himself from a conflict that wasn't his to fight. But the part of her that had watched him calm Sovereign during the fireworks, that had seen him work alongside Alfie with patient kindness, that had felt something shift in her chest when he looked at her with those dark, understanding eyes. That part felt like it had been gutted. "Miss Amelia?" Mrs. Whitby's voice came from the stable doorway, tentative and concerned. "I saw you come in here. and you've been standing in that same spot for 10 minutes. Is everything all right?" Amelia turned, and she knew her face must have given everything away because Mrs. Whitby's expression immediately shifted from concern to something deeper, more protective. The older woman had been with the Ashford family for 20 years, had seen Amelia through her father's death and all the struggles that followed, and she had the uncanny ability to read emotional weather like a barometer. "He's gone," Amelia said simply, holding up the letter. "Tom. He left sometime before dawn." Mrs. Whitby's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Did he now? And I suppose he had his reasons?" "He says he did." Amelia's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Says his history with Fairfax makes things complicated. Says some battles are better fought alone." Humph. Mrs. Whitby's snort of disapproval could have stripped paint. Men and their noble gestures, always thinking they know what's best for everyone else, never bothering to ask what the women in their lives might prefer. She stepped closer, her weathered hands gentle as she took the letter from Amelia's fingers. "May I?" Amelia nodded, watching as Mrs. Whitby's eyes moved across Tom's careful handwriting. The housekeeper had raised 3 sons of her own before coming to work for the Ashfords, and she had strong opinions about masculine pride and the damage it could do to otherwise sensible relationships. "Well," Mrs. Whitby said finally, folding the letter with precise movements, "he's not wrong about caring for you. I'll give him that. But he's a fool if he thinks running away is the answer to whatever trouble he's brought to our door." "Maybe he's right, though," Amelia said, surprised by how defeated she sounded. "Maybe I am better off without whatever complications he represents. God knows I have enough problems without adding romantic entanglements to the list." Mrs. Whitby's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her steel-gray hairline. "Romantic entanglements? Is that what we're calling it when 2 people find something worth fighting for in the middle of all this chaos?" Before Amelia could respond, the sound of bicycle tires on gravel announced Alfie's arrival. The boy appeared in the stable doorway moments later, his red hair wind-blown and his face bright with the kind of enthusiasm that only 16-year-olds could maintain in the face of adult complications. "Morning, Miss Amelia. Morning, Mrs. Whitby," he called out cheerfully, then looked around with obvious confusion. "Where's Tom? I thought we were going to work on fixing that loose board in Duchess's stall today." The simple question hit Amelia like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on her own sense of betrayal that she hadn't considered how Tom's disappearance would affect Alfie, who had clearly come to see the older man as something between a mentor and a friend. The boy's face fell as he took in their expressions, his natural optimism dimming like a candle in the wind. "He's gone back to London," Amelia said gently. "He left early this morning." "Gone?" Alfie's voice cracked slightly. "But why? I mean, he seemed happy here. He was good with the horses, and he was learning so much about the estate. Why would he just leave?" It was Mrs. Whitby who answered, her voice carrying the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of dealing with life's disappointments. "Sometimes, lad, people leave not because they want to, but because they think it's the right thing to do. Doesn't make it any less painful for those left behind, but it doesn't make them bad people either." Alfie nodded slowly, but Amelia could see the hurt in his young eyes. Tom had been the first adult male figure in the boy's life who had treated him as an equal, who had listened to his ideas and taught him new skills without condescension. His absence would leave a gap that went beyond simple friendship. "Will he come back?" Alfie asked quietly. Amelia looked down at the letter in Mrs. Whitby's hands, at Tom's careful sketch of a guitar, at words that felt like both an apology and a goodbye. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I really don't know." As the morning wore on and they went through the motions of daily routine, feeding the horses, mucking out stalls, checking water troughs, Amelia found herself listening for the sound of footsteps that wouldn't come, looking toward the stable door with a hope that felt increasingly foolish. Tom had made his choice, had decided that whatever secrets he carried were more important than whatever connection they'd been building, and she would have to find a way to accept that. But as she stood in Sovereign's stall, running her hands along the stallion's neck while he nuzzled her shoulder with unusual gentleness, she couldn't shake the feeling that Tom's departure was about more than noble sacrifice or masculine pride. There had been something in his eyes during those last few days, a growing peace that seemed to settle over him like morning mist over the moors. Men didn't usually run from things that brought them peace, which meant that whatever had driven him away was bigger and more dangerous than he'd let on, and Amelia Ashford was about to face the fight of her life completely alone. The morning train to London had already left the station, carrying Tom Hawthorne and his secrets back to whatever life he'd tried to escape. But the consequences of his brief presence at Ashford Grange were only beginning to unfold, and Amelia had no idea that his greatest act of protection was yet to come. The call came at precisely 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Tom's disappearance. While Amelia was mechanically going through the motions of feeding the horses, the voice on the other end of the line was crisp, professional, and utterly bewildering in its implications. "Lady Ashford, this is Margaret Thompson from Barclays Private Banking. I'm calling to confirm that your outstanding mortgage balance has been settled in full as of this morning. The payment was processed through our London office, and I wanted to ensure you received proper notification." Amelia nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Your mortgage, Lady Ashford. The full amount of £847,000 has been paid by wire transfer from an anonymous benefactor. The estate is now free and clear of all encumbrances. Congratulations." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Amelia gripped the stable doorframe, her knuckles white against the weathered wood, trying to process words that made no sense in the context of her reality. Anonymous benefactor? Who in God's name had nearly £1 million lying around and would choose to spend it saving a failing estate in Northumberland? "There must be some mistake," she managed to say. "I don't know anyone who would—" "I assure you there's no mistake, Lady Ashford. The transfer was legitimate, properly documented, and the funds have cleared. You should receive official confirmation by post within the next few days. But I wanted to call personally to deliver the good news." After the banker hung up, Amelia stood in the stable doorway staring out at the moors, her mind reeling with possibilities. Mrs. Whitby found her there 20 minutes later, still clutching the phone like a lifeline, tears streaming down her face. "My dear girl, whatever's wrong?" the housekeeper asked, immediately moving to Amelia's side with the protective instincts of a mother hen. "The mortgage," Amelia whispered. "Someone paid it off, all of it. The bank says we're free and clear." Mrs. Whitby's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. Free and clear? But who on earth would— Oh. Her expression shifted from confusion to understanding, and then to something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "Well, well, perhaps some people have more sense than we gave them credit for." Before Amelia could ask what she meant, the sound of expensive tires on gravel announced another visitor. But this time, instead of the predatory purr of Fairfax's Range Rover, it was the angry growl of an engine being pushed too hard by someone in a hurry. The black vehicle that screeched to a halt in front of the manor house bore the same luxury badges as before, but there was nothing composed about the man who emerged from it. Lord Julian Fairfax looked like a man whose carefully laid plans had just exploded in his face. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled, his Savile Row suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it, and his face was flushed with the kind of rage that comes when someone accustomed to getting their way suddenly finds themselves outmaneuvered. "Lady Ashford!" he bellowed, striding across the courtyard with the fury of a man who just discovered his prey had escaped the trap. "What the hell do you think you're playing at?" Amelia stepped out of the stable to meet him, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair coursing through her veins. The knowledge that her family's legacy was safe, that Fairfax's predatory schemes had been thwarted, filled her with a fierce joy that made her feel 10 feet tall. "Lord Fairfax," she said coolly, "how lovely to see you again. Though you look rather upset, I do hope nothing's wrong with your business ventures." "Don't play innocent with me," Fairfax snarled, his aristocratic composure completely shattered. "I know what you've done. I know who's behind this sudden windfall of yours." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Amelia replied, and it was the absolute truth. She had no idea who had saved her estate, though she was beginning to have suspicions that made her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. "Thomas Hawthorne," Fairfax spat the name like a curse. "Your mysterious house guest who disappeared so conveniently just before your mortgage was paid off. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out?" The mention of Tom's name hit Amelia like a physical blow. Tom paid the mortgage? But how could he possibly? He said he had financial difficulties of his own. Fairfax's laugh was bitter and ugly. "Financial difficulties? Is that what he told you?" "Lady Ashford, Thomas Hawthorne is heir to one of the largest property development fortunes in England. His family's company, Hawthorne Holdings, has been buying and selling estates like yours for 3 generations. The only difficulty he's had is deciding whether to follow in Daddy's footsteps or pretend to have a conscience." The words hit Amelia like hammer blows. Tom was wealthy? His family were property developers? Everything he'd told her about leaving the city, about his guilt over his father's business practices, about being a simple trader with a guilty conscience, had it all been lies? "I can see you're beginning to understand," Fairfax continued, his voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "Poor little Lady Ashford, thinking she'd found her knight in shining armor. But Thomas Hawthorne isn't your savior, my dear. He's your competition. His family has been circling this estate for years, waiting for the right moment to swoop in and add it to their portfolio." But even as Fairfax spoke, Amelia found herself shaking her head. The man who had risked his life to calm Sovereign during the fireworks, who had worked alongside Alfie with patient kindness, who had sung lullabies to frightened horses in the dark, that man wasn't capable of the kind of calculated deception Fairfax was describing. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "Whatever Tom's background, whatever his family's business, he's not like that." "Isn't he?" Fairfax pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph that made her blood run cold. It was Tom, but not the Tom she knew. This Tom was wearing an expensive suit, standing in what looked like a corporate boardroom, shaking hands with men in similar attire. The caption beneath read, "Hawthorne Holdings announces expansion into heritage properties." "This was taken 6 months ago," Fairfax said. "Right around the time your financial troubles became public knowledge. Quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Before Amelia could respond, the sound of a diesel engine chugging up the drive announced the arrival of the local bus. It was an incongruous sight. The battered red double-decker that connected the rural villages to the larger towns, stopping here in the middle of nowhere as if it were a regular route. The door wheezed open, and Tom Hawthorne stepped down onto the gravel drive. But this wasn't the polished businessman from Fairfax's photograph, nor was it the mysterious stranger who had arrived in the storm. This Tom looked like he'd been through a war. His clothes were simple and worn, his expensive watch was gone, and he carried nothing but a small duffel bag that had seen better days. Most tellingly, his hands, the hands that had once been soft with city privilege, were now calloused and scarred from honest labor. "Hello, Julian," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying none of the deference that might have been expected from someone addressing a lord. "I wondered when you'd show up." "Thomas," Fairfax replied, his tone arctic. "Come to gloat over your little victory?" Tom's eyes found Amelia's across the courtyard, and she saw something in them that made her chest tighten with emotion. Not guilt or calculation, but a kind of weary hope, as if he was afraid to believe he might still be welcome here. "I came to see if Amelia would have me back," he said simply. "If she'll let me stay and help rebuild what we've saved." "We?" Fairfax laughed harshly. "How touching. The prodigal son returns to claim his prize. Tell me, Thomas, does Lady Ashford know the full extent of your family's involvement in the rural property market? Does she know that Hawthorne Holdings has been responsible for turning more historic estates into golf courses and shopping centers than any other company in England?" Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny the accusation. "She knows what she needs to know. That I'm not my father, and I'm not the company that bears my name anymore." "Anymore?" Amelia found her voice at last. "What do you mean, anymore?" Tom reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a sheaf of legal documents, their official seals and ribbons marking them as serious business. "I sold my shares," he said quietly. "All of them. Every stake I had in Hawthorne Holdings, every trust fund, every inheritance that was supposed to be mine. I liquidated everything and walked away." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind across the moors and the distant lowing of cattle in the valley below. Fairfax stared at Tom as if he'd announced his intention to fly to the moon, while Amelia felt the world shift beneath her feet once again. "You gave up everything?" she whispered. "Your entire inheritance? Your family's legacy?" Tom's smile was sad but genuine. "Some legacies aren't worth preserving. Some families build their wealth by destroying what other families have spent centuries creating. I decided I'd rather be part of the solution than part of the problem." He held out his hands, those calloused, scarred hands that told the story of his transformation from city trader to working man. "I know I left without explanation, and I know you have every right to tell me to get back on that bus and never come back. But if you'll have me, Amelia, I'd like to help you build something better here. Something that honors what your family created instead of destroying it." Fairfax made a sound of disgust. How perfectly nauseating. The rich boy playing at being noble. "You'll be back in London within a month, Thomas, mark my words. People like us don't belong in places like this." "You're right," Tom said, his eyes never leaving Amelia's face. "People like you don't belong here, but maybe if I'm very lucky, I can learn to become someone who does." As the sun broke through the clouds and painted the moorland in shades of gold and green, Amelia looked at the man who had given up everything to save her family's legacy and felt something shift in her heart that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with love. The real battle for Ashford Grange was just beginning, but for the first time in months, she no longer felt like she was fighting it alone. The first light of dawn painted the Northumberland moors in shades of gold and purple, and for the first time in months, Amelia Ashford woke without the crushing weight of impending doom pressing down on her chest. The mortgage was paid, the estate was safe, and Tom Hawthorne was back. Not as the mysterious stranger who had blown in with the storm, but as a partner in the monumental task of rebuilding what generations of neglect and financial pressure had nearly destroyed. They gathered around the kitchen table that had witnessed countless family meetings over the centuries, but this felt different from the desperate strategy sessions of recent months. Mrs. Whitby had prepared a proper English breakfast: eggs, bacon, black pudding, grilled tomatoes, and toast thick enough to stand on, while Alfie sat with a notebook, his young face serious with the responsibility of being included in adult planning. Tom had traded his expensive clothes for work gear that actually fit, and his hands wrapped around his tea mug bore the calluses of someone who had learned the value of honest labor. "Right then," Amelia said, spreading out a hand-drawn map of the estate on the scrubbed oak surface. "We've got 800 acres, most of it moorland, a manor house that needs about £50,000 worth of repairs, stables that could house 20 horses if we fix the roof, and exactly zero income beyond what Sovereign can earn in stud fees." Tom leaned forward, studying the map with the focused intensity he'd once brought to analyzing financial markets. "What about tourism? This area is gorgeous, and people pay good money for authentic countryside experiences. Riding lessons, guided tours across the moors, maybe even overnight stays for people who want to experience life on a working estate." "The insurance alone would bankrupt us," Amelia replied, but there was interest in her voice. "Public liability, horse insurance, accommodation licensing, it's a nightmare of red tape and expense." "Not if we start small," Alfie interjected, his pen poised over his notebook. "My cousin works at the tourist board in Hexham. She says there's huge demand for day experiences, people from Newcastle and Edinburgh who want to escape the city for a weekend. We could offer half-day riding lessons, picnic lunches, maybe evening rides when the light's good for photography." Mrs. Whitby nodded approvingly. "The boys got sense, and we've got advantages the big commercial operations don't. Authentic history, family stories going back centuries, and Sovereign. That horse is magnificent enough to be a tourist attraction, all by himself." Tom pulled out a battered laptop that had seen better days, its corporate logos scraped off and replaced with stickers from local pubs and hiking trails. "I've been researching while I was away. There's a whole network of heritage estates that have successfully transitioned to sustainable tourism. Chatsworth, Longleat, even smaller places like us. The key is finding your unique selling point and building everything around that." "And what would ours be?" Amelia asked, though she was beginning to see the possibilities spreading out before them, like a map of uncharted territory. "Authenticity," Tom said simply. "Real aristocratic life, not the sanitized version you get at the big tourist traps. People want to feel like they're stepping into a Jane Austen novel, not a theme park. They want to meet the horses, learn about the history, maybe even help with the daily work if they're feeling adventurous." Over the next several hours, their plans took shape with the kind of organic growth that comes when the right people find the right idea at the right time. Alfie would handle the social media and booking system, his generation's natural comfort with technology making him invaluable for reaching younger tourists. Mrs. Whitby would oversee the hospitality side, drawing on decades of experience managing the household to create the kind of authentic English country experience that money couldn't buy elsewhere. Tom's role was more complex. His financial background made him the natural choice for managing the business side, but his real value lay in his understanding of both worlds. the privileged expectations of wealthy tourists, and the practical realities of rural life. He could speak the language of insurance brokers and licensing officials, while still knowing how to muck out a stable and calm a frightened horse. "We'll need to start with the basics," he said, making notes on his laptop. "Get the stables properly repaired. Install basic safety equipment. Maybe convert the old servants' quarters into simple but comfortable guest rooms. Nothing fancy at first. Clean beds, hot water, and the kind of hearty breakfast that makes people feel like they're staying with family." Amelia found herself caught up in the enthusiasm, her mind racing with possibilities she'd never dared to consider. "We could offer different packages for different interests. Riding lessons for beginners, advanced training for experienced riders, historical tours for people interested in the family history. Maybe even photography workshops. The light on the moors is incredible at sunrise and sunset. And seasonal events," Alfie added, his notebook filling with ideas. "Christmas at the Manor, Easter egg hunts, summer solstice celebrations. People love that kind of thing, especially if it feels authentic rather than commercial." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle in the courtyard, but this time it wasn't the predatory purr of Fairfax's Range Rover. Instead, it was the cheerful rattle of the local postman's van, followed by the appearance of Derek Hutchinson, who had been delivering mail to Ashford Grange for the past 15 years. "Morning, Lady Amelia," Derek called out as he approached the kitchen door with a bundle of letters. "Quite a bit of post for you today. Some of it looks official. Hope it's good news for a change." Among the usual bills and circulars was an envelope that made Amelia's heart skip. The return address showed the logo of the Northumberland Tourism Board, and the letter inside was an invitation that seemed almost too good to be true. "They want to include us in the Heritage Trails program," she said, reading aloud with growing excitement. "It's a partnership between the county council and local estates to promote authentic rural tourism. They provide marketing support, help with licensing and insurance, even offer grants for infrastructure improvements." Tom looked up from his laptop, his eyes bright with possibility. "That's exactly what we need. Official backing gives us credibility with tourists and makes the whole insurance situation much more manageable. When do they need an answer?" 2 weeks, Amelia replied, but she was already mentally composing her acceptance letter. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like the universe was conspiring to help rather than hinder her efforts to save the family legacy. The rest of the morning was spent in detailed planning, turning dreams into actionable steps. Tom would handle the business registration and insurance applications, drawing on contacts from his city days who owed him favors. Alfie would create a basic website and social media presence, using his natural talent for photography to showcase the estate's beauty. Mrs. Whitby would begin the process of converting guest rooms, her decades of experience with household management making her the perfect person to ensure everything met the exacting standards of paying guests. Amelia's role was perhaps the most challenging, learning to see her family's legacy not as a burden to be preserved, but as a living, breathing entity that could adapt and thrive in the modern world. It meant opening doors that had been closed for generations, sharing stories that had been kept within the family, and trusting strangers to respect what her ancestors had built. "It won't be easy," Tom said as they stood in the stable doorway, watching Sovereign graze peacefully in the afternoon sun. "Running a tourism business is hard work, and there will be days when you wonder if it's worth the hassle of dealing with difficult guests and bureaucratic red tape." "Nothing worthwhile is ever easy," Amelia replied, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained 8 generations of Ashfords through wars, economic upheavals, and social changes. But for the first time in years, I feel like we're building something instead of just trying to hold on to what's left. As the sun began to set over the moors, painting the ancient landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the four of them stood together in the courtyard, looking out over land that had been saved not just by money, but by the willingness of people to believe in something larger than themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight they had hope, they had plans, and they had each other. The real work of rebuilding Ashford Grange was just beginning. But for the first time in months, Amelia Ashford believed they might actually succeed. 1 year later, the transformation of Ashford Grange was nothing short of miraculous. The ancient estate that had once teetered on the brink of financial ruin now buzzed with the kind of purposeful energy that comes when people discover they're part of something larger than themselves. The annual Ashford Open Day had drawn visitors from across northern England and southern Scotland, their cars and tour buses filling the newly gravelled parking area that Tom had carved from an unused corner of the lower paddock. Amelia stood at the edge of the main arena, watching as Sovereign cleared a series of jumps with the effortless grace that had made him a legend in the regional show circuit. His rider was Sarah Chen, a 24-year-old investment banker from Edinburgh who had started coming to Ashford for weekend riding lessons 6 months ago and was now competing in her first official show jumping event. The irony wasn't lost on Amelia, a former city worker finding peace and purpose through the same horses that had once seemed like an impossible financial burden. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice crackled over the public address system. "That's a clear round for Sarah Chen riding Sovereign, representing Ashford Grange Equestrian Centre. What a magnificent performance from both horse and rider." The crowd erupted in applause, and Amelia felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Sarah lean forward to pat Sovereign's neck with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. The gray stallion had become more than just a prize-winning horse. He was the living symbol of what could be achieved when tradition and innovation worked together instead of fighting each other. Tom appeared at her elbow, his face flushed with pride and exertion from helping to set up the cross-country course that wound through the heather-covered hills behind the manor house. His hands were permanently stained now with honest dirt and horse sweat, and the expensive watch he'd once worn had been replaced by a simple timepiece that could survive being dunked in water troughs and knocked against fence posts. "Sovereign's looking good out there," he said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned to find joy in simple accomplishments. "Sarah's really come along since she started with us. Remember when she was afraid to trot?" Amelia laughed, remembering the terrified young woman who had arrived at Ashford 6 months ago, fresh from a nervous breakdown brought on by the pressure of her high-stress job in financial services. Now Sarah was planning to leave the city entirely, using her savings to start a small riding school in the Scottish borders, inspired by what she'd experienced at Ashford Grange. "It's not just about the riding, though, is it?" Amelia mused, watching as families spread picnic blankets on the grass while their children fed carrots to the gentler horses in the petting area. "It's about remembering that there's more to life than spreadsheets and profit margins." The festival continued around them with the kind of organized chaos that comes when a community comes together for a common purpose. Mrs. Whitby had organized a team of local women to run the tea tent, serving proper English afternoon tea with scones, clotted cream, and jam made from berries picked on the estate. Alfie, now 17 and preparing for university, managed the social media coverage with the natural ease of his generation, live streaming highlights to followers who had become invested in the Ashford story. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, bureaucratic nightmares, and moments when the whole enterprise seemed doomed to failure. The first group of paying guests had arrived to find the hot water system broken and half the guest rooms still under renovation. A summer storm had flooded the lower paddocks just days before a major equestrian event, forcing them to relocate everything at the last minute. There had been difficult customers, insurance complications, and the constant challenge of balancing commercial success with the preservation of the estate's authentic character. But somehow, they had persevered. The key had been learning to see challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles, and understanding that the real value of Ashford Grange lay not in its buildings or its land, but in its ability to connect people with something timeless and essential. Urban visitors discovered muscles they'd forgotten they had, learned to read the weather in cloud formations, and went home with a deeper appreciation for the food on their tables and the landscapes that produced it. The business model they'd developed was deceptively simple, but remarkably effective. Day visitors could come for riding lessons, guided tours of the estate, or simply to walk the moorland trails and enjoy a traditional pub lunch in the converted stable block. Weekend guests stayed in the renovated servants' quarters, which had been transformed into comfortable but unpretentious accommodations that felt more like staying with friends than checking into a hotel. The real innovation, however, was the Heritage Partnership Program that Tom had developed with the local tourism board. Instead of competing with other rural attractions, Ashford Grange had become the hub of a network that included local artisans, organic farms, historic sites, and traditional craftspeople. Visitors could spend a week in Northumberland, staying at different locations, but using Ashford as their base for activities that ranged from dry stone wall building to traditional cooking classes. "The numbers came in this morning," Tom said quietly, pulling out his phone to show her the latest financial reports. "We're not just breaking even anymore, Amelia. We're actually profitable. Not hugely, but enough to start thinking about expansion." The word expansion would once have terrified her, conjuring images of the kind of commercial development that had destroyed so many other historic properties. But the expansion Tom was talking about was different. More guest accommodations built in traditional materials, additional riding trails that would showcase different aspects of the moorland ecosystem. Perhaps even a small conference center where businesses could hold retreats focused on sustainable practices and work-life balance. As the afternoon wore on and the competition concluded with Sovereign taking first place in the open jumping class, Amelia found herself thinking about her father and what he would have made of the changes at Ashford Grange. He had been a traditionalist, convinced that the old ways were always the best ways, resistant to change even when change was clearly necessary. But she liked to think he would have approved of what they'd accomplished, not because they had preserved the estate exactly as it was, but because they had found a way to honor its essential spirit while adapting to the realities of the modern world. The real lesson of the past year, she realized, wasn't about money or business models or marketing strategies. It was about the difference between self-reliance and isolation, between independence and stubborn pride. For too long, she had tried to carry the burden of the estate's survival entirely on her own shoulders, seeing any offer of help as a threat to her family's dignity. Learning to accept assistance, first from Tom, then from the wider community, hadn't made her weaker. It had made her stronger, more connected, more capable of facing whatever challenges the future might bring. As the sun began to set over the moors, painting the ancient landscape in shades of gold and purple that had inspired poets for centuries, the crowd began to disperse. Cars pulled away down the drive, their occupants carrying with them memories of a day spent in a place where time moved more slowly and life felt more authentic. children fell asleep in back seats, clutching stuffed horses and dreaming of galloping across endless heather-covered hills. Tom and Amelia stood together in the stable doorway, watching as Sovereign was led back to his stall by one of the young volunteers who had become part of the extended Ashford family. The great horse moved with the satisfied weariness of an athlete who had performed well, his silver coat gleaming in the lamplight, his intelligent eyes reflecting the contentment that comes from being valued for what you are, rather than what you're worth. "Thank you," Amelia said quietly, the words carrying the weight of everything they had been through together. "For coming back, for staying, for believing this was worth saving." Tom's arm slipped around her waist, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the months they had worked side by side to rebuild not just the estate, but their own understanding of what really mattered in life. "Thank you for letting me stay," he replied, "for teaching me that some things are worth more than money, and that the best investment you can make is in something that will outlast you." As they walked back toward the manor house, its windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk, Amelia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The financial crisis that had once seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something better, a new way of living that honored the past while embracing the future, that valued tradition without being trapped by it. The real nobility, she had learned, didn't come from titles or bloodlines or ancient privileges. It came from taking responsibility for something larger than yourself, from using whatever resources you had, whether money, skills, or simply determination, to make the world a little better than you found it. The Ashford legacy would continue, not because it had been preserved unchanged, but because it had been allowed to grow and evolve while staying true to its essential values. And if you've enjoyed this story of transformation and hope, if you've been inspired by the idea that even the most desperate situations can be turned around with courage, creativity, and the willingness to accept help when it's offered, then please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Because England isn't just about Big Ben and red double-decker buses. It's about the heartbeat of small communities, the rhythm of rural life, and the enduring power of people who refuse to give up on the things they love. There are more stories like this waiting to be told, more examples of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to preserve what matters most. Join us next time as we explore another corner of this remarkable country, where tradition and innovation dance together like partners who have finally learned each other's steps.